I'm gonna let it shine. All around the neighborhood, I'm gonna let it shine. All around the neighborhood, I'm gonna let it shine all the time, let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm gonna let it shine all the time, let it shine. One more. Don't let Satan it out. I'm gonna let it shine. Don't let Satan it out. I'm gonna let it shine. Don't let Satan it out. I'm gonna let it shine all the time, let it shine. You may be seated.
Good morning. It is good to be together this morning. We do have a little bit of a smaller crowd. We have quite a few people who are traveling today, but we also have families who have family in. And so we are just delighted to have those who are visiting with us today. We are thankful for your presence. And we hope that as we spend time together this morning, we'll have an opportunity to visit with you and make you feel as welcome as possible. As we get into our lesson this morning, we have been in a series, as Mike mentioned, entitled Living in the Light of Eternity. We've been focusing on the idea that we are to live our lives in view of our eternal future, our eternal home. But the reality is that we struggle with living our lives focused more on the here and the now. And we have a tendency to just kind of go through life thinking that things just kind of happen. It's just all kind of a big accident, and whatever happens just in life, we deal with it as it comes. You might have heard the saying that there are only two things that are sure in life, and they are what? Death and taxes, right? We think that when we're living our lives based on the here and the now. That when we live our lives based on this world and viewing everything in light of this world instead of eternity, that's kind of how we view life. That those are the only things we can be sure of. Everything else is just going to happen. Whatever it is, and I deal with it. It reminds me of a story of a Texas rancher. He was an older gentleman, had been ranching out in Texas for many years, and he decided it was time to get some life insurance. And so he went to an insurance agent and sat down with her and started filling out the paperwork. And she said, okay, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. And she says, well, the first question is, have you ever been in any accidents? And the rancher said, oh, no, never. And she said, in all the years you've been ranching, she said, you've never been in any accidents? No. She said, you're telling me you've never been hurt? And he said, oh, I've been hurt. He said, yeah. He said, a number of years ago I was out clearing out a field for some cattle, and I was turning over rocks, and I turned over a rock, and a rattlesnake just popped out and bit me, put me in the hospital for weeks. And then a few years later, I was bull riding, and the bull bucked me off and then stomped on me, broke my leg, cracked several ribs, dislocated my shoulder. And he said, it took me a long time to get over that. And the insurance agent, she said, well, sir, she said, don't you think those are considered accidents? And he said, oh, no, they both did it on purpose. The reality is that's kind of how we sometimes view life, that it's just a series of accidents, it's just a series of things happen. But I submit to you this morning that with God, there are no accidents. There are just divine appointments. You see, our God is in control. I'm reminded of the promise we have in Romans 8 and verse 28, where God tells us through the Apostle Paul that we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. You see, when we live life in view of eternity, we understand that God is ultimately in control. Corrie ten Boom once said, "Don't bother to give God instructions, just show up for duty." And isn't that our call? Just be there. God's going to take care of the rest. But as we look at this, this is really the heart of the man we're going to be considering today. This is really the heart of Daniel. See, Daniel, though he didn't have a full picture of it, Daniel lived his life in view of eternity. He viewed his life based on his relationship with God. Daniel was a young man who really had every reason to view his life based on his worldly situation. And yet, he viewed his life in view of eternity. Now, a little background on Daniel. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 2 in just a moment. But a little background here. There was a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. He was an idolater. He worshipped a lot of what we would call little g gods, right? He worshipped all these different idols, and a case could even be made that he also worshipped himself. Nebuchadnezzar was that kind of king, and he makes the decision to attack and conquer the land of Judah. Now, Judah was one of the tribes of Israel, and the land, the area of Judah was their home. And the significant point about Judah was that in the very heart of Judah was the city of Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem was the center point of their religion and their faith. And so what Nebuchadnezzar did when he attacked Judah is he was actually attacking the very heart of Israel. And when he does, he takes many of the people as his slaves, and Daniel was one of those slaves. Now, Daniel was a teenager at the time, and based on the description we have in Scripture, Daniel would have been one of those like popular kids in high school. One of those guys that I was not, right? He was one of those popular guys in high school because the Bible says he was athletic, he was good looking, and he was smart. In other words, he had it all going on, right? He had all those things that people look to. He would have likely been a leader among the other people his age. And so here he is living in Judah as a teenager, and he's on the top of the heap. He's one of the best looking guys, one of the smartest guys. He's winning all the races. He's got everything happening good for him in his life. But then he is taken captive, and overnight he becomes a slave. And here he goes from the top to being taken to this dark and godless place where he's now at the bottom. And that's where we pick up in Daniel chapter 2. Because in Daniel chapter 2, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar had been having these dreams. And he didn't understand his dreams. He didn't understand what they were about. He knew they had to mean something. And so Daniel 2 tells us that he brings in all of his top advisors. It says he brought in his magicians and enchanters, his sorcerers, and his astrologers. Your Bible may say Chaldeans. And he brings all of these wise men from the country in, and he doesn't just ask them to interpret his dream. Because, see, evidently King Nebuchadnezzar was a little skeptical. And he knew that if he just told them his dream, then they can make up some kind of interpretation. So he got smart. What King Nebuchadnezzar did is he said, I want you to tell me my dream and then tell me what it means. In other words, interpret the dream after you tell me what it is. And so these men, they were shocked by this, and their response was, King, no one on earth could do that. And he's like, wait a minute, you're supposed to be, wise men and interpreters and sorcerers, and why can't you do that? And so the king tells them that either they interpret his dream or tell him his dream and interpret it, or he will tear them apart limb by limb. And the king doesn't stop there. He then sends out a decree that all the wise men in the kingdom are to be put to death. Now, he puts in charge of this task a man by the name of Arioch. He was the military commander, and he was in charge of carrying out this order. And so that is where Daniel then comes into the picture. Look at verse 14. Remember, Daniel is a slave. He's just come into this land that he's not sure of. But Daniel goes and speaks to Arioch. It says, "And Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon." So here is Daniel, and he is able to convince Arioch to give him an appointment with the king. Now just think about that for a moment. First of all, what had King Nebuchadnezzar just ordered everybody else who had gone in to see him, ordered to happen to them? They were supposed to be torn apart limb by limb, right? And now Daniel's saying, hey, can I please go see the king? But not only that, here is Daniel actually being granted the request. He is a slave. He is an Israelite who has just been taken captive, and now he gets to go before the king. And so he convinces Arioch of this. He goes before the king, and he doesn't interpret the dream right away. He tells the king basically, give me some time. Give me some time, and I will come back and I will tell you your dream, and I will interpret it for you. Let's get down to verse 26. It says, "The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, 'Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?' Daniel answered the king and said, 'No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked.'" And so here's Daniel back before the king. The king says, "Okay, give me the info. Tell me what you need to tell me. Tell me the dream that I had, and then tell me the interpretation." And Daniel starts off by saying nobody else has been able to do it. No one else has been able to give you that information. But then look at verse 28. He says, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and visions of your head as you lay in bed are these." And so Daniel says, none of these other guys were able to tell you, and I on my own can't tell you, but there is a God in heaven who gave you this dream. This didn't come from just anywhere. This came from God himself. And God is going to reveal the answer to you. And so Daniel then begins to relate the dream. And I'm going to do this in layman's terms. I'm going to paraphrase very simply the dream here. He basically tells him that the king had a dream about a statue. And the statue had a head of gold and a chest and arms of silver. It had a belly and thighs of brass. It had legs of iron and feet of clay. And then this rock comes basically out of nowhere, and it vaporized the statue, and it was gone. He then goes on to tell him the meaning of the dream. And he tells him that each part of the statue represents a different earthly kingdom, and each kingdom will have its season, but each one will leave. And then he tells him that God's kingdom will destroy all the others, and God's kingdom will last forever. And so here's Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar, basically, Nebuchadnezzar, you and your kingdom have a shelf life. It's not going to last. Not only is your kingdom going to be destroyed, but all kingdoms that are earthly will be destroyed. none of them will last forever. And yet the God of heaven will have a kingdom that will never be destroyed. It will always last. Now it's interesting that Daniel is telling King Nebuchadnezzar a truth that is one that mankind has always struggled with. Do you realize that just about every nation that has ever existed on this earth has thought that they are the greatest nation and that they will last forever, including the United States? Every nation thinks they're the greatest. Every nation thinks they're going to be here after every other nation is gone, right? And yet God tells Daniel, or tells King Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel, your great kingdom, the kingdom that you think is the greatest, Babylon, it's not going to last. But there is a kingdom that will be eternal. Look at verse 44. It says, "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever." So that is the message that God speaks to King Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel. Look at verse 47. It says, "The king answered and said to Daniel, 'Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery.'" Now let me ask you, why would King Nebuchadnezzar believe Daniel? Because Daniel did something that no one else could do. Daniel told the king what had only been in the king's mind. Daniel knew what no one else knew, and he could only know that through God. And so here in this story, and there's a lot more to the story of Daniel. I encourage you to read the book of Daniel sometime. I encourage you to read it many times through. Actually, there's a lot there. But I want us to spend the remainder of our time this morning looking at three things that we can learn from these events with Daniel. Three things that I think will help us understand what it means to live life in view or in light of eternity. The first one is this. Daniel stepped up. Daniel stepped up when no one else was willing to. Daniel stepped up when it really didn't make sense for Daniel. You see, Daniel stepped up in a way and took a risk that no one else was going to take. He did something that just didn't make any sense to do, because for Daniel, what would make sense would be just to kind of blend in. Buy my time, blend in, fit in as a slave, be the best slave that I can be, but just blend in, right? Just fit into everybody else. Don't stand out. Don't call attention to myself. And yet God really sends a message to Daniel. Daniel, I've got something else for you. You've got to step up. And in verse 14, it says, "Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon." Daniel steps up. Here is a teenager and a slave going to an executioner and to a king. Does that make any earthly sense? No, it does not. And I'm sure that Daniel probably had a few thoughts going through his mind about that fact. That it did not make any earthly sense. And yet Daniel stepped up to do what no one else would do because God called him to do it. Now, how was Daniel able to do this? How was Daniel able to step up in this way? Well, the first reason, I believe, is that he knew who he was, and he also knew who his king was. See, Nebuchadnezzar was not Daniel's king. He would show him the respect due him. He would treat him as he should. But he was not Daniel's king. Daniel served the true king. The eternal king. He served the God of heaven. And Daniel understood that. He understood his purpose. And so because he knew who he was and he knew whom he served, he was able to step forward and do something that seemed not only unlikely, but even impossible. You see, that's who Daniel was. Daniel understood who he was. I think oftentimes in our lives we go through life struggling with understanding who we truly are, because how many times have we convinced ourselves or allowed Satan to convince ourselves that it's our job to fix everything? It's our job to take care of everything. It's our job to right all the wrongs. It's our job to do all these different things because no one else can do it like I can. You know, I have a reputation in my family because I'm the one who does most of the cooking, and I don't like people in the kitchen with me. You know, I just don't. And you know, I just want everybody to get out of the way and just let me do my thing because that's my job, you know. And the thing is, if I mess something up, then I can own it, you know. But if you mess something up, it's on me, and people are going to look at me for it, and I didn't do it, you know. So just step aside and let me run my kitchen. How many of us live our lives thinking that about our day-to-day lives? Just everybody get out of my way and let me live my life. Let me take care of my stuff because nobody's going to do it like I can do it, like I can manage it. But you see, we're not doing it because we're trusting in God. We're doing it because we want control. This was not about control for Daniel. Daniel had already given his control over to his king. He'd given control over to the God of heaven. And so for Daniel, it wasn't about Daniel trying to fix anything. He was just doing what God had called him to do so that God could position the situation to do what God planned to do what God had purposed. And so Daniel knew who he was and who his king was, but the second thing that we see here is that Daniel not only had control of his emotions, he made sure that his emotions did not have control of him. How often do we live our lives trying to get control of our emotions? You know, here's Daniel. He had every reason in the world to just lose it. You know, have you had any thought today about what you might have done if you had been in Daniel's position? You know, we would likely be there and say, well, you know, look what's happened now. Here I am. I had everything going in my life, but now I've got this. I'm stuck and I'm a slave, and who knows what's going to happen to me. Now I've got somebody who's going to be telling me what to do, and now here's this king. He's wanting to go around and kill a bunch of people. I don't know. He might want to kill me. What did Daniel do? Daniel just went up and said, hey, is there any way I can speak to the king? You see, Daniel had control of his emotions. He didn't allow his emotions to control him. And because Daniel understood who he was and whom he served, and because Daniel was able to give control of his emotions over to God and let him dictate his actions, Daniel was able to step up. Daniel was able to step forward. And the message this morning is that when we live life in view of eternity, there are going to be times when God calls us to step up, to step forward in ways that may not make a lot of sense to us at the time. It may not be the thing that seems sensible to us at the time, and yet because we live life in view of eternity, we step forward and do what God has called us to do. Daniel stepped up, but the second thing we see is that Daniel knelt down. You see, because Daniel's life wasn't about Daniel, Daniel was able to humble himself before God. In Daniel 2, picking up, let's look again at verses 17 through 19. It says, Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And so Daniel goes and he says, let's stop and take some time to petition the God of heaven. Let's take time to go before him. And Daniel didn't just go before God himself. He asked his companions, his friends, to go before God as well. And then as we read on, we find that Daniel, after he spent time in prayer, he went to bed. And while he was in bed and was sleeping, God revealed to him the king's dream. And then if you continue to read, what you find there is that when Daniel woke up from that vision or dream, Daniel spent time praising God. And I want you to notice this morning that Daniel, when he was in the midst of one of the most difficult moments in his life, he was going to have some more to come, but he is at that point, probably up to that point in his life, one of the most difficult moments. And Daniel prayed, got some rest, and praised. He took time to petition the Father. He took time to rest and let God work in his life. And then he praised God for what God had done. You know, none of us know what our future holds. You know, I look back to the past 6 years, and I think with the things that Brenda and I have been through over these past 6 years, a lot of good, but also a lot of not so good. If you had asked me 20 years ago, would you be going through these things in your life, I would have said, no way. That's not my future. That's not what the future holds for me. I've got plans. I've got things that I'm going to do. I've got a direction. The reality is there's not a one of us here who knows what our future holds. None of us probably would have anticipated that we would be where we are today. But guess what? If the Lord sees fit to give us another 10 or 20 years, none of us know where we will be then as well. We don't know what our future holds. Daniel did not know what his future held. But Daniel, like us, knew exactly who holds his future. We do not know what our future holds, but we do know that God is ultimately in control of that future. And so what Daniel did here is Daniel took time to step up and do what God called him to do, but he also stepped down. He knelt down. He humbled himself, submitted himself to God, and allowed God to work through him, to guide him where he wanted him to go. But then the third thing we see is that because Daniel lived life in light of eternity, Daniel stepped back. Daniel stepped back and let God work. In verses 26 through 28, we see that the king asked Daniel, he said, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? And Daniel replies, no, I can't. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And so what Daniel does here is Daniel steps back and he lets God shine. You see, Daniel did something a lot of people would not have done. I think there are a lot of people in this world who would have said, yes, king, I can tell you exactly what's in your dream. Let me tell you what I know. And a lot of people would have laid it all out for him and taken all the credit. But Daniel says, no, listen, none of this is on me. I'm just the messenger here. I'm just the vessel getting this to you. but it's the God of heaven who reveals this mystery. You see, Daniel stepped back and he allowed God to shine. It reminds me of John the Baptist, what he did towards the end of his ministry. See, John the Baptist, his purpose was to prepare the way for Christ, but there was a period in John's life where John was the one getting the attention. Everybody knew about John. Even the people who didn't like him knew about John. He was the crazy guy that lived out in the wilderness, and dressed funny and said a lot of crazy stuff. But then there were people who were following John, and they hung on every word that he had to say. And so there was a time where John was in the limelight. He was getting all the attention. But then in John 3 and verse 30, John says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." John says, I'm going to step back and allow Jesus' light to shine. You see, John understood his purpose. And he knew that there was a time when he needed to step back and allow Christ to shine because Christ's ministry was just beginning. And so he did what he was called to do. I'm also reminded of John 5, verses 14 through 16. Matthew 5, verses 14 through 16. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 14. Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Now, I want you to really notice what he's saying here. We're not going to get into all the details of the analogies or the description here, but Jesus says here that we are the light. He says, you are the light. And yet, if you really look at this, notice who gives the credit, or who gets the credit. Because he says there, verse 16, "In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and" what? "Give glory to the Father who is in heaven." You see, we may be the one shining, but who's really shining? God. You see, the glory goes to God, and so it's about stepping back to let God shine through us. We are to be light, but we're not our own light. We're his light. Because he's in us. And because he is in us, we are his light. And so we step back not to shine ourselves, but to allow him to shine through us. You see, we are the light when we step back and allow God's glory to show. That's what Daniel did. Daniel had every opportunity to take all the credit. If you read on through the rest of Daniel, you find that the king over and over again tried to give Daniel credit. He tried to lift up Daniel and make Daniel prominent. And yet, what did Daniel continually do? He allowed God to shine through him. You see, if you are in Christ, you are the light. But what do we do with that? What do we do with that light? Well, first of all, we need to step up and do the things that God has called us to do, even when it doesn't make sense. Do the things that God has called us to do, even though the world's going to tell us something very different. We need to step up, but number two, we need to kneel down. We need to humble ourselves before God and allow God to work through us, and then we need to step back and allow God to shine through us. You know, God will do amazing things in and through you when you live your life in light of eternity. Be the light and allow God to shine. If you're subject to the invitation, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.